Oh no. Hi, everybody. Oh boy. Hold on. There you go. Is that rare time when I got YouTube started and I actually got it up and running before started. Luckily, I to be fair, I do just press a button to switch and it was up and running. But I don't know. Anyway, hello everybody. I'm back again and I'm here with basically for those of you just tuning in, I am currently reading my dad's manuscripts. Ah. Um, I read a chapter a night, and also I mark them up for editing. So, um, so far so good. I'm on chapter 11 of 32. So if you are just tuning in, I do recommend that you go back to previous broadcasts and watch the other parts of the show first so you can get an idea of what the story is about. Each their own. If you are wacky and crazy, you can certainly come in almost a third of the way through. That is a choice. Anyway, yeah, and it's literally about a third of the way. So, yeah, I blah 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 blah. Sorry, live is so much fun. Live streaming. Mwah. Anyway, so I will start off with when last we left our heroes off. This is a new thing I'm doing. I'm actually doing a quick recap so you can kind of get an idea of where we're at. I'm not going to have like a big recap over the whole entire story because that's what the past broadcasts are for. But I will say, when we last lost our heroes yesterday, they were being attacked by goblins. And things were not looking good. And our main character got knocked out. So let's see where they ended up and what's going on. And then, if you stick way around to the end of this chapter, I have a little something special to show everybody. Anyway, without further ado, chapter 11. When he first woke, he knew that he had had a nightmare. Oh, and that's chapter 11 of the Saga of Haram. I'm getting better at this. I swear. It's my first time doing it, guys. When first he woke, he knew that he had had a nightmare about being attacked by goblins. Then he felt the pain in his head, and he knew it had been no nightmare. He sat up groaning. Then he saw to his horror that the goblins were still about. They had plundered the camp and were apparently having discussions as to the division of plunder. One of them noticed Haram and stepped over toward him. And before Haram could move, the goblin had grabbed a fistful of his hair and pulled his head back and laid a knife against his exposed throat. At that moment, there was a command in the goblin language, and the knife wielder released him. The goblin chief swaggered over to him and leaned down to look at him. Ha! Not much to you, isn't it, Lynch? Haram, stiff with fear, made no answer. The goblin chief cuffed him on the side of the head. You answer when we talk to you, boy! Wow, they sound like they're from the scene of Deliverance. That's neither here nor there. I mean, I'm sure goblins are very nice. Anyway, divulge. Haram gathered his wits as best he could. Yes, sir. It seemed the safest thing to say. He heard one of the goblins mutter two words, then the whole band broke into raucous laughter. The leader turned toward his. The leader turned to look at his followers, then looked back at Haram. So, boy, at least you got a hard head. Sorry, at least you got a hard head, eh? I think maybe we keep you for a while. Yes, sir. Again, the goblin translated, and the other goblins laughed. Now, you stand up and come along with us, and be careful. We have little need of slaves. Make no make no matter to us if we had to slay you. Yes. The first thing Harem learned was that he was always wrong. If he walked slowly, he was beaten for lagging. If he walked quickly, he was beaten for trying to run away. If he hurried to serve when he was ordered to do so, he was beaten for presumption. If he did not hurry, he was beaten for laziness. Any order given to him was reinforced by a cuff or a kick. He was the least among the least of the goblins, and the lesser goblins found this out quickly. They were delighted to find someone by whom they could vent their frustrations. When the leader put forth orders that only he should be able to injure the slave severely enough to hinder his walking, they rapidly learned how to deal lesser injuries. Harem was never without a bruise or wound somewhere on his body. As the days lengthened into weeks, he also learned never to try to retaliate for even the grossest unfairness, for that would only earn him more beatings. He learned some of the goblin tongue, though much of it through being beaten for not understanding. When he learned not to speak too well either, for that was also presumption. He learned not to think beyond the next few moments. There was never a time where he could have escaped for all the beatings he received for supposed attempts at it. When they marched, he was in the midst of the column, surrounded by on all sides. When they camped for the night, he was chained by the ankle to a wooden peg driven into the ground. Even if he were to somehow break the wooden stake without awakening everyone nearby, flight with half an arm's length of chain dangling noisily at his ankle would be impossible. He learned all of their names. Orgatha was the chief. Grohak was second in command. Haraga was the who was in charge of scouting, and there was also Rakag. Sorry, bear with me here. Vrakka. Vrakka was not one of the officers, nor was he one of the lower goblins, but he took delight in making life miserable for Harem. He would invent errands for Harem to do, errands which invariably ended with Harem receiving a beating for something. In his early days with the goblins, he was approached by Vrakka. Go to Grohak, he commanded. Tell him Nishmat ul Fwada. Worn out and weary, Harem merely did as he was told. Approaching Grohak, he said, Nishmat ul Fwada. Grohak roared in anger. He began bellowing at Harem, all the time battering the boy with his great fists. All Harem could do was to try to tell him, Vraka told me to. Grohak finally quieted down enough to listen to him, then gave him one more clout. Vraka, he shouted. The slave says you sent him to me with insults. And Vraka, of course, beat Harem for trying to shift blame. He used variations of the same trick from time to time, always with success, for Harem could not escape a beating, usually two. If he refused to go, he was beaten until he changed his mind. Once he delivered the message, he was beaten again. He learned not to admit that anyone had sent him, for if he were silent, he would be beaten longer. If he admitted to having been sent, someone else was always called to give him further beating for shifting blame. It was once during one such episode that he finally caught sight of his sword. One day, after Vraka had played his trick again, Harem found himself again admitting that Vraka had sent him. He already knew it was futile to hope that he would escape more beatings. Vraka! Roared Grohak. The slave says you sent him to me with insults. Ha! Again he tries to escape the blame for his own misdeeds. Vraka strode over to begin beating Haram again, and Haram suddenly recognized the sword of the god at the goblin's hip, the sword which Orit stood bought, the sword with which he had learned all he presently knew of swordplay. He had never before taken notice of Fraka's sword, but he saw it now. Somehow it made a difference. There was no possibility he could wrench the sword from the scabbard and escape, but it gave him something to hope for. There might come a time, an instant's chance, when he might recover his sword. He might not escape, but he would kill some of them and force them to kill him. Of course, he could force them to kill him at any time. He knew that. But he wished more than mere death. He wished some sort of revenge. He had was reason for beating. But within his mind, as Vraka was beating him, he formed a resolve. He would survive. Whatever they might do to him, one day, when the chance came, he would take his sword from Vraka and wield it. He kept that thought in his mind from then on. He felt that eventually they would come to see him as a harmless, a mere object, there to be beaten for any reason or no reason at all. They would then become careless, and at that time he would find a chance, an opening. Day by day, day followed day, and much of his time was taken up with avoiding beatings as far as possible. He was always aware of Raka and the sword, wherever they might be in the column, but he was careful not to allow that awareness to lead him into careless offense. He wondered once if, in seeking to lead the goblins to consider himself as harmless, he might indeed turn into that harmless thing he was emulating. When the time came, he would merely stand by, staring at the sword hilt, fearing to touch it, lest it would mean another beating. He shut that thought out of his mind. If he indeed felt that, he would run screaming mad now, clutching at the nearest goblin's throat until they cut him down. And all that would remain was a laughing memory in a few goblin minds. No, when he made his attempt, he would be sure that the goblins did not remember him with laughter, but with silent dread. However long it took, he would not forget. The story has taken a turn. They traveled a long way. Haram had asked once where they were going to, and was beaten for presumption. He never asked again. He did hear, after he began to understand the goblin tongue somewhat better, that they were under orders from the king of the goblins, who seemed to live off in the north somewhere. Exactly what those orders were was not clear, though it seemed to be a far-ranging scouting expedition. They stayed away from towns. They were not adverse to raiding an occasional isolated farmstead, particularly when they were in need of fresh meat. Haram himself seldom accepted meat from a goblin, unless he'd actually seen the carcass from which it originally come. He would occasionally eat plants from lessons. This was a source of enjoyment to the goblins. The younger ones would elbow each other and call to him, "Cow slave, there's a fine patch over there. Only a few nettles." Then they would laugh uproariously. Haram, intent on surviving, ignored them as best he could. Occasionally, they wandered their way amongst and around and up and down green-covered hills. Haram thought he recognized part of the country. He had to admit, though, that he had not traveled extensively enough in Eridar to be sure of recognizing anything. He was only sure that they were still in Aradar by the look of the farms and houses that they saw. One day, they were toiling up the slope of a hill, brown grass hissing under their feet, the afternoon sun beating on their backs. They were going up the hill rather than taking the easy way on account of a few goblins who have been grumbling a little too much about always having to work so hard. "Hard work, is it?" snarled Orgotha. "Let's see about hard work, then. Up the hill, all of you. and 5 lashes for any laggards. Haram knew that this meant 10 lashes for him if he lagged, so he kept keeping up. He worked at keeping up. Orgatha strode at the head of the column, demonstrating to any and all that he was the equal of any goblin under his command. Haram staggered on, carrying the burden of odds and ends which Orgatha and Grohawk had loaded on him. His eyes were fixed on the heels of the goblin in front of him, and he concentrated on taking one step at a time. His lungs were bursting, but he knew what would happen if he paused for a moment, so he forced himself to go on. There was a sudden strangled shout from the head of the column, then the sound of goblins crying in terror. He forced himself to look up and saw that Orgatha was no longer leading them. There was confusion ahead, goblins milling about, and he heard the goblin word for ambush being repeated through the ranks. Hoofbeats sounded ahead, and 3 riders came over the hill just to the left of the column, loosing arrows into the goblins. There were shouts of pain and fear now, though somewhere Haram thought he heard the sound of Grohawk's bellowing orders, attempting to reorganize the goblin force to meet the threat from ahead. Haram was suddenly aware that this was the opportunity he'd been waiting. Vraka had been ahead of him in the column, but the column was turning into a seething lump of goblins, despite all Grohawk's angry shouting. Haram cast the bundle off his back and looked around. There were goblins running past him, afraid for their lives. But there were others ahead who realized that their best hope was to stand and fight. He pushed his way forward. Looking for Vraka. There was no sign of him. Had he gotten away already? Or was he perhaps dead further ahead? Then he suddenly caught sight of the sword. It was still in its sheath, and Vraka was bending a bow, aiming a shaft at one of the horsemen. Haram leaped. Vraka was hardly aware of Haram's hand on the sword hilt when Haram pulled it free. Vraka half turned to see what was happening. Frantically, Haram swung the sword at the goblin's face. Vraka partially interposed his bow, but so strong was Haram's blow that it cut through the bow and halfway through the goblin's head. For a moment, Haram stood looking down at the dead goblin. Then he felt more than heard a movement next to him, and barely brought the sword up in time to parry a stroke from a goblin on his right. He was too slow to return the blow, and the goblin was striking again. Haram was surprised to find that his hand had not forgotten all the moves Orits had drilled into him. His parry was automatic. The return stroke this time was also automatic, and though the goblin parried in his turn, there was surprise on his face. He had forgotten that they had taken Haram after a fight. He had forgotten that Haram had ever been anything but a cow slave to be ordered about and beaten for any reason or no reason at all. In fact, that surprise slowed the goblin sufficiently that Haram was able to strike again, and this time the goblin's parry was too slow. Haram looked around again. The goblins who remained in the vicinity were dead, and the remainder were fleeing away back down the hillside. There were 6 men in various sorts of armor standing by, and one of them stepped over, extending a hand. He spoke in a heavy accent. "Give us the sword, boy. 'Tis part of the plunder." "It was my sword, and it was taken from me when I was captured." "Aye, and 'tis no longer yours, for it passes from the goblins to us. Give it over." His hand was still extended, but the smile left his face. I imagine you have lots of questions. So do I. I will also mention to those of you just tuning in, I am just reading this now. This is my first time reading this manuscript, so I have no idea where the story goes. It's as much of a mystery to you as it is to me. That's why there's a lot of although there would be a lot of anyway, because that's just the way I talk. Um, but it sounds like Harem's getting into more trouble. He got captured by goblins and became a slave for a little while. And who are these strangers who just beat up a bunch of goblins and probably another? Well, you know what? I'm not going to say anything. We'll find out tomorrow. So until then, I will talk to you all again soon. Thank you so much for tuning in. And yeah, anytime between, okay, I started early tonight. Last night was late. Tonight was early. Yeah, I mean, sometime in the evening. I'm sorry. You're probably better off just to like check the past broadcasts because I'm a little all over the place. Sometime in the evening. I mean, I want to try and get it probably between 6:30 and 8:30, but it might be a little bit earlier because sometimes if I get off work early and I don't have a lot of stuff going on, it could be as early as a little bit after 6. So maybe the comfort zone. I'm gonna just start going when I'm ready, and it may fluctuate a bit, but I think the safe times to say are like between 5:30 and 8:30. Yeah, a 3-hour chance. There's a 3-hour block of time where I might be here streaming. Um, yeah, this is why I didn't post a schedule. This is why there's past broadcasts so that people can tune and watch them because they never know I'm on. It's every night, but just not what time. And then I will tell you when I'm taking breaks. So there's that. But I will let you all know about that later. Until then, I will talk to you all again very soon. So thank you very much and have a good night.